Okay, so hello everyone. I'm very happy to introduce Professor Dr. Jessica Triscoe Darden and to host her in Ariel University Center for the Research and Study of Genocide to introduce her new book called The Accused, How Women Face Justice for Nazi Era Crimes. So Jessica Triscoe Darden Dr. Jessica Triscoe Darden is an associate professor of political science at Virginia Commonwealth University. Her research focuses on women's roles in political violence from the Second World War to the present. She is also the author of 4 books, including Women as War Criminals, Gender, Agency, and Justice by Stanford University from 2020. And her current research focuses on women's integration into combat in national militaries. Thank you very much, Professor Triscoe Darden, for being with us. And now the floor is yours, and you can begin your presentation.
Thank you. And I do want to thank Ariel University for providing me this opportunity. This is my first presentation of this research, so I welcome all of your feedback, things that you wanted to know more about. Please do let me know. Uh, so as as was mentioned, my research prior to this focused on women as war criminals, and specifically my co-author Isabella Stiefla and I focused on 4 women who had been prosecuted in various capacities for war crimes. And so this included the genocide in Rwanda, the conflicts in the former Yugoslavia, specifically Plavšić in Bosnia, as well as Lindy England, who was accused of war crimes against Iraqi civilians during the US occupation of Iraq, and Huda Muftana, who is a US born Yemeni citizen who was denied reentry to the United States because of her affiliation with the Islamic State group. But in profiling these 4 women from different countries of different backgrounds, I really wanted to understand what the legal precedent for women's prosecution as war criminals had been. And in doing so, when we look back historically, there just aren't that many options. The cover depicts Judith slaying the Syrian general Holofernes. We have these kind of iconic women who were engaged in crimes against specific military leaders or in wartime contexts. But we actually have a very limited record of how judicial systems handled these sorts of individuals. And so this really spurred my research on women's accountability for the Holocaust and Nazi-related crimes. So the book has 3 parts, and the first is really an investigation of this idea of women as war criminals. And I start the book by asking readers to engage in kind of speculation or imagination about women's war crimes. I ask, how do we imagine the women of the Nazi era? And whether these popular depictions, right, whether pop culture as we know it now has any relationship to the reality of women during that era. So I'm going to share some examples of this kind of popular imagining with you. So this first set of images is taken from the mid 1970s. On the left, we have Ilse Shewolf of the SS. This is what is known as a sexploitation film. So it was heavily sexualized, very campy, very corny. And in this movie, Ilse was a medical doctor. She was the commandant of a concentration camp. She was also a sexually insatiable Black widow who would murder her sexual partners after she failed to achieve satisfaction. She had blonde underlings who would take their shirts off to flog prisoners. And in this concentration camp, they did medical experimentation on Jewish women as well. Eventually, the Allies are arriving, the prisoners rise up, they murder the camp guards, the Allies liberate the camp. And one of the American political prisoners speculates on the future of justice for the Nazi war criminals. The other image is from a 1977 Marvel Comics cover, which introduces the character of Warrior Woman. Now, Warrior Woman was a Nazi scientist. She was experimenting to create superhuman strength to help the Nazi military. Fortunately or unfortunately, she spills her chemicals on herself and grows to colossal proportions and becomes this kind of ultimate Nazi enemy with a whip and knee-high boots, right? So we have these very hyper-sexualized imagining of what Nazi women were in the mid-1970s. And then as we move into the 2000s, and most recently in the 2023 movie Zone of Interest, we see this kind of softer, perhaps, but not quite sympathetic depiction of women in the Nazi era. In the film Reader, which is based on a German novel from the mid-1990s, we have, Kate Winslet, a famous Hollywood actor, depicting a concentration camp guard who, even though she's sexually exploiting a teenager, we're asked to sympathize with her because she is illiterate. She's unable to read. In Zone of Interest, we also see a woman who's kind of crushed by the burden of motherhood and the responsibilities of being the wife of a camp commandant, but who also clearly benefits and enjoys the benefits of this system of exploitation. So we kind of have these two poles, right? We have the kind of sexually explicit depiction, but also this kind of sympathetic, perhaps motherly depiction. But the reality is that the vast majority of female perpetrators that I identify in this study don't conform to either of these stereotypes. So this was a picture taken in 1945 by a British Army officer when the British liberated Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. They interned all of the female guards who remained at that camp. So in this image, you can see 4 relatively young women. None of them are particularly sexualized, right? They're wearing standard issue uniforms, boots, thick socks. And it's really the story of these women that I spend the rest of the book examining. I refer to them as the accused, as this kind of unnamed collective, because very few of their individual stories remain in the historical record. But I think it's important to distinguish them for a variety of reasons. So first of all, who are the accused? Who am I talking about in this book? I define it as women who participated in the atrocity crimes of the Nazi regime, both voluntarily and through forced methods. And it's really important to note that this included many of the crimes of the Holocaust, but not exclusively Holocaust-related crimes. So many of the women that I talk about also, for instance, participated in the Action T4 euthanasia program, which largely targeted German citizens of various category groups.
Sorry to interrupt again, because I just had a question. Can everyone see the presentation? So you're having problems there?
Yeah. What's happening? Why can't I see?
I see everything.
All right, let me just reshare it and see if that helps.
Perhaps. Now I see it. Yes, sorry.
Okay, great.
Thank you, and thank you for pointing this out. Yeah.
Awesome. So let me go back to our image then, right? These are real women who were captured by British forces at the liberation of Bergen-Belsen. And for me, this is a really interesting photo because one of the women is partially obscured, right? Their faces are quite blurry in the photography. And so they've really maintained this level of anonymity in the historical record. And so part of the work that I'm trying to do is kind of uncover what we do know about women like this. And so in focusing on women who perpetrated atrocity crimes during the Nazi era, we learn a few things. I have identified by birth date and name approximately 400 women from the German records. In addition to that, I've identified women primarily from the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic and the Soviet Union, Hungary, France, and cases from Israel as well, which I'll discuss a little bit today. Largely, we know that these women were ethnically German, both within Germany and in other countries such as Hungary. But we do know that women of minority ethnicities participated in atrocity crimes as well. So, for instance, one of the translators that worked for the Nazi intelligence service in occupied Crimea was an ethnic Tatar woman, and she was actually recommended by her community to serve as a translator for the Nazis. The cases that I examine date from 1946 until 2024. And during that period, the women who were prosecuted ranged in age from 18 to 96 years of age when their verdicts were issued. We know from the German records about half of these women were married, 14% were unmarried, 7% were divorced, and 9% were widowed. That also gives you a reflection of the age range of these women. And we know that at least 15%, probably much higher, were mothers or grandmothers. And so it's really a wide-ranging, diverse group of women who participated in these acts. What specifically were they accused of? And so depending on which country you're in, there were kind of slight definitional differences, but for kind of ease of understanding, I've grouped them into four main categories. The first category that women were accused of after the war was having made a false denunciation. So making a report to authorities, accusing someone of a punishable act. And in order for a denunciation to be prosecuted after the war, prosecutors had to prove that it was made out of racial malice, political malice, or ill intent, right? That they were not simply doing what they thought was right, but understood that there was some kind of negative motivation to the report they were making. Another major category of crime was euthanasia, primarily participation in the Aktion for Euthanasia program. And this made up roughly 20% of women who were prosecuted in Germany. Another major category was concentration camp crimes. So this covered both crimes that were committed in the day-to-day functioning of the camps, so for instance, physical assaults, as well as crimes that occurred while the camps were being evacuated at the end of the war, when there were mass transportations of prisoners. Collaboration was another really prominent charge, and this varied significantly across countries in terms of what it covered. But collaboration referred to a range of behaviors. It could be economic collaboration, it could be kind of personal sexual relationships with occupying Nazi forces. It could be providing intelligence, working for the intelligence services, working for the Gestapo, etc., in an occupied country. But it covered a kind of wide range of behaviors where an individual woman was cooperating with occupying Nazi forces. The second part of the book digs deep into specific examples of women and the accusations that were made against them and how courts determined innocence or guilt in the face of those accusations. I draw on these roughly 450 cases to create a theoretical framework. I suggest this theoretical framework. I think people can understand these cases however they wish, but I offer this theoretical framework as one way for understanding this kind of diversity of women. So I create these four categories, and the first is empowered perpetrators. So women who had access to social and institutional power under the Nazi regime, either through direct membership in the Nazi Party or affiliated women's organizations, or for instance, through their spousal relationship to a member of the SS or other ranked Nazi official. And these women were able to essentially exist within the system with very few risks of repercussions to themselves. A second category in this kind of power hierarchy are subjected servants. And these are individuals who were good German citizens who were trying to do their job in an environment where what their job was changed very rapidly. So if we think, for instance, in the German context, all nurses were public servants. They were employed by the state to work in hospitals and could be transferred at will. The same was true for prison guards. They could be moved from a women's prison to a concentration camp. And so some of these women really struggled with the things that they were being asked to do in this new context. Another category is opportunistic beneficiaries. They didn't have a direct association with the Nazi regime, but they were nevertheless able to use the system for their personal benefit. And we see this a lot with women who participated in denunciations. And the final and perhaps most interesting category is those of the entangled victims. And these individuals possessed only the power granted to them by the system. So for instance, women in concentration camps were appointed to be guards over other prisoners. Women who had committed kind of petty crimes were enlisted by the Gestapo to serve as bait to draw men out into saying anti-regime things. And so there are these just very fascinating cases of women who were really shaped by social pressure and the risk of personal harm to themselves. So I'm going to give us a couple examples of these, and if we're running short on time, please move me along. So the first is from the District Court of Dresden in the immediate aftermath of the war. I will note in the German records, they do have a kind of partial anonymization, and so you'll see the surnames are abbreviated, and that's exactly how they're reported in the records. So Hilde Fick rented out rooms in her home while her husband served in the military. After a heated argument in 1941, she reported her tenant, Doris, for insulting her husband, World War I veteran, and Hitler. Doris was arrested by the Gestapo. She was diagnosed as a psychopath and sent to a sanatorium where she died in 1944, likely under the Nazi euthanasia program. After the war, Hilde was charged with crimes against humanity and received 2 years of probation and a fine. There's obviously a much more lengthy discussion of the case in the book, but this is our abbreviated version for the point of comparison. Slightly later, in 1951, we have a case that comes before the District Court of Magdeburg. At this time, we have already had separation into West Germany and East Germany, and I'm happy to speak about that more. Hildegard, once a farm worker with no criminal record, was arrested by the Gestapo for sexual relations with Polish men and sent to Ravensbrück concentration camp. Near the war's end, she joined the camp police. She was accused of beating inmates and taking part in the killing of newborns. The court accepted that she had been victimized, but ruled that she willingly adopted Nazi ideology. Hildegard received a 10-year sentence for crimes against humanity and permanently lost her pension and political rights. And in 1965 in Munich, we see Louise worked as a nurse from 1930 and joined the Nazi Party in 1933. Sent to Meseritz Oberwald in 1941, Louise directly assisted in at least 10 cases of euthanasia by giving injections or administering pills. As head nurse, she oversaw more than 100 medicalized murders. After the war, Louise found work in Sweden before returning to West Germany. Tried in 1965, the court found that the testimony against her was not reliable, objective evidence. Louise's testimony that she was easing patient suffering could not be refuted. She was acquitted. So what I think these three cases demonstrate is kind of the wide range of crimes, but also outcomes that women face. So we have an acquittal, we have a 10-year prison sentence, and we have 2 years of probation. So I'm going to speak more now about the direct personal consequences that the women accused of these crimes faced. And I think it's really important to note that while most of the book focuses on kind of legal courtroom-based accountability, that accountability was in fact wide-ranging, and it became very swiftly after the war, as early as 1944 in some places. Before it moved into the courtrooms. And so in the book, I briefly discuss 3 other forms of accountability. The first is Jewish honor courts, and Dan Porat has actually done a lot of this work in the Israeli archives to focus on the central role that Jewish accountability for Jewish perpetrators, the different forms that took. And so one example in the image here, we have Stella Kubler, née Goldschlag, who collaborated with the Berlin Gestapo to identify Jews in Berlin. She was accused of identifying more than 2,000 members of the Berlin Jewish community. And after the war, the community was very persistent in holding her to account. She actually had 3 trials against her. It went until the mid-1970s before there was a verdict in 1975. And you see kind of this relentless effort by Jewish communities to hold Jewish perpetrators to account. There were also widespread reprisal killings, including against women. So I recount in the book one incident where a mob essentially was trying to drag a woman out of her house. She ran up to her roof. She fell off the roof, and they did not render her any aid or assistance after she fell off her roof. And we also see widespread public shaming. This primarily took the form of forced head shaving. So we have one image here from the Netherlands. The crowd image is from France, so very different geographic context. There are also reports that this was done widely throughout parts of the Soviet Union. So women who had been accused of collaboration with occupying forces were rounded up by their neighbors and community members. As you can see in the crowd-based photo, in some instances, they were stripped down to their undergarments. We know that there is photographic evidence that some women were tarred and feathered as part of this as well. Others also had swastikas tattooed onto their bodies by these crowds. And the women were forcibly shorn, right, as a mark of their dishonor, right? And obviously the hair has a long and powerful history that we can get into. But what's very interesting from my perspective is that all of these different communities from different parts of Europe essentially saw this as what you would do to shame a woman, right? To shave off her hair, to render her unfeminine, to expose her body to the public. And I think what's also important to note, although almost exclusively men were the ones shaving the hair of these women, you can see that women were clearly in the crowd as spectators positioned in the front row to witness this public humiliation. We also see the expansion of legal justice. In the book, I refer to it as a kind of patchwork of accountability. Prosecutions began in occupied zones of Germany as early as 1945. We see the first trials in Kharkov in the former Soviet Union at that time as well. The Allied military have military tribunals and trials for this period between 45 and 49. But we also see local legal systems in what later became East Germany and West Germany also begin to prosecute female defendants in 1946. And I'm not going to go into it very much here, but in the book, I really focus on how the reforms of the legal systems in East Germany under kind of this Soviet model, and in West Germany, the kind of lack of reform, the inability to get Nazis out of the judiciary, really shaped the focus of those different legal systems and the accountability for female perpetrators. So one really famous example of a military prosecution is that of Ilse Koch. She was the wife of the former commandant of Buchenwald. There's a very excellent recent history of her trials called Ilse Koch on Trial. She is fascinating because she was not really accused of directly committing crimes. Instead, she was seen as a perpetrator through her association with her husband, but also because she benefited from some of the crimes. So, for instance, there was the use of forced labor in her villa outside Buchenwald. So very similar to what was depicted in Zone of Interest. But she really became a fixation of the media. There were allegations that she had lampshades made out of the tattooed skin of concentration camp prisoners. There was no evidence that was ever presented for these kind of wild allegations. She rode around on horseback. There were allegations that she sexually abused inmates of Buchenwald. And so she really was the first fascinating Nazi woman, but as you can see from her appearance in court, she in no way matches these kind of hypersexualized images that became part of the imagination. So my takeaways for you today, and I'm glad we'll have lots of time for questions. I argue in the book that yes, the women of the Nazi era were constrained by the environment in which they operated, right? There were clear ideas of female conduct, obedience, hierarchy, racial and otherwise, right? But nevertheless, each of these women had agency and had the ability to make decisions about how they would behave in their own lives, whether they would file a report, whether they would ask to be transferred to another hospital, right? Whether they would choose to discipline or not discipline a concentration camp prisoner. And after the war, circumstances beyond their control continued to impact their lives. So one of my key findings is that place, in terms of geography, what legal system the women ended up under, and when they happened to be prosecuted, mattered a lot for the consequences they faced. Women who faced accountability in the decades after the war tended to have more lenient sentences. The evidentiary requirements became more and more stringent, so it became harder to prove that these crimes had occurred. However, I think that this isn't just a story about the Holocaust or just a story about the Nazi era. I think there is this long-standing legacy about post-war justice's biases against women as perpetrators that persists in today's accountability efforts. And as someone who a decade ago did a lot of work on the Islamic State group and women's contributions to the Islamic State group, we see that the media really struggled to see women involved in that group as anything but victims, right? And we see it today in other authoritarian contexts such as Iran, that we know that there are very strong supporters of the regime and women who are working to uphold that regime, and yet we continue to only have this narrative of women as victims of the regime. And so I hold all of those examples in mind in my analysis of this era. And with that, I will close and take any questions you might have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jessica. This was fascinating, and I have tons of questions, but I'll open the floor. I'll let other people ask first, if anyone wants to go first, or just raise your artificial hand or your real hand because we can see them.
Jessica, from Virginia. Or the Commonwealth. Anyway, I have to leave pretty soon, so I'm going to ask a question and then unfortunately have to slide out. But I appreciate your presentation, and I actually am very much looking forward to reading your book. It's definitely an understudied part of the Holocaust and beyond. I know you go beyond. As you were kind of categorizing the women, did you try to make distinctions between those who, well, the Germans per se, but like you had a picture of the women who had their hair cut off in, I think it's the Netherlands. Do you make distinctions between the Germans themselves and then those who were like in occupied areas, I'm thinking Western Europe, and their collaboration?
So I deal with those women in two separate chapters. So one chapter focuses exclusively on Germany, where we have a lot of rich detail about the women, their ages, their marital status, their number of children. I have it all in a spreadsheet, and other countries, including the Soviet Union, France, Hungary, Israel, and the United States are the specific countries that I focus on. Because you're right, we do see very different patterns in the crimes that women are prosecuted for. So for instance, in Hungary, we had a very prominent right-wing journalist who was prosecuted for essentially issuing Nazi propaganda. And so I think it's important to include these other countries. And I'm so excited that we have a scholar of Romania here as well, which I don't include, unfortunately, in this book. So that opportunity is wide open. Because I think we as scholars and don't do a good enough job kind of differentiating between all of these groups. Mm-hmm. And understanding the different conditions that led to collaboration or participation in different places. So for instance, in France, we know that women who were accused of collaboration were relatively young. Most of them were unwed. Some were unwed mothers. We know that their primary motivations were economic in nature. And that's just very different from women who collaborated in other contexts.
I appreciate that. And I appreciate you talking about women still having agency in a very, very difficult situation. And so I think that's an important conclusion.
And I would love to come out to see you if you have any time. I
might be in touch. I'm going to be in Richmond in a month or so. So
great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else?
No, Peter. No, come on.
I thought you were the first. Thank you so much. Actually, my question / suggestion was very brief. I just thought, have you thought about extrapolating the historical account of these women into the current and modern and ongoing neo-Nazi and far-right milieus? Because, well, this is something that the scholars have started now to investigate, and there is a seminal work, for instance, by Evian Ledig and some others, but still this remains a bit underexplored context. So do women have agency and how they frame it for themselves, like their participation in the radical neo-Nazi circles today, and if they reference somehow the experience of their, if we may say so, predecessors, and can they serve as role models for the current neo-Nazis and so on? So that was some kind of a question, provocation, whatever.
So the argument that I make kind of regarding this in this book, but also elsewhere in my writings, is that essentially we assume that groups with ideologies that we would define as patriarchal or harmful to women or limiting to women actually have very strong support from women. So this was true in Rwanda, where the Hutu Ten Commandments created really circumscribed roles for women, right? Women were bearers of Hutu culture and morality, and Tutsi women were seen as promiscuous and all of these things. We see it in the Nazi era. We see it in groups like Boko Haram or Al-Shabaab or the Islamic State, where women's main contributions to the group are through sexual service, bearing and raising children to promote the ideology, right? And serving as kind of partners and handmaidens to male fighters, right? And I actually think this is very consistent across these groups and into kind of neo-Nazi movements, or what we in the US, call the trad wife movement, which is kind of Nazi adjacent. So no, I haven't specifically done that study, but I do think that there's lots of fertile ground there. What I think is really important, though, is that the kind of enabling context is very different across these different examples or historical contexts, and the goals of the movement are very different as well. And so that's where I think that I personally would have a harder time making that direct comparison.
Okay. Eyal, go ahead.
All right. Let me present myself again now, so it'll be more interesting perhaps. I've made a few documentaries, Holocaust documentaries, for television and for film. And my upcoming book deals with the image of the Jew in Dutch cinema. And my question to you, and I'll explain why I ask that, and maybe I missed it in your presentation, is whether you make a distinction between the non-Jewish perpetrators and the Jewish perpetrators. Because what I found in Dutch cinema, which is very interesting, is that the Jewish women who collaborated with the Nazis or were seen as collaborating with the Nazis were punished as harshly as the non-Jewish ones. And you can physically see what they're going through. In fact, the picture you just showed might have a Jewish woman in one of them, one of those pictures. They were put together with non-Jewish women, shaven. Mm-hmm. And do you make a distinction in your book? Maybe I missed it. Because in film, it's interesting. They just treat them the same in Dutch films.
So I make a distinction to the degree that it is relevant to the outcome that the women faced, right? So for instance, the women who were prosecuted in Israel under the Nazi and Nazi collaborators Act, right? They were all Jewish women. Some held German citizenship and some did not, right? So in that context, there's no direct comparison to non-Jewish women because none came and were prosecuted by the state of Israel. In other contexts, like for example, the case of Stella Goldschlag, right? She was prosecuted first by a Soviet military tribunal and sentenced, and then she was re-prosecuted by West Germany. And I don't really differentiate her case from other cases that were prosecuted under the system other than the actual content of her case. Right. So there were other Gestapo informants that I talk about in the book, but she specifically focused her actions on Berlin's Jewish community. And her case was more complicated as a result. But I don't think that her decision-making process and the way that the system treated her was that significantly different from the way it handled similar cases.
Anyone else wants to go? Okay, so if I may ask a couple of questions. It is fascinating, really, Jessica. I wanted to ask if you could tell us what is if there is data about how many, if there is any estimation about how many women are considered, or at least in percentage, estimate. I mean, is there any estimate about the percentage of women that were actually considered Nazi criminals? And does this does this data correlate the number of cases that were actually prosecuted? So I'm asking about the interest of society in general, and actually which societies also I want to ask were interested or are still interested in prosecuting women Nazi perpetrators, because we know that society has great interest in Nazi men perpetrators until today, and you presented only cases from maybe until the mid-60s. You didn't talk about anything going further. Also, I noticed that it was not really independent Germany that was prosecuting. It was mainly like occupied Germany. So it was mainly the interest of the Allies or of Russia, I mean, of the USSR, and then the United States or the other allies. So what would you say about independent Germany? Does Germany have interest in prosecuting these women? So I'll stop here.
Yeah, no, these are all really important questions, and I do address them in the book. So, for instance, on the question of kind of the sheer number of women that we might consider being implicated in the crimes of the Nazi regime, Wendy Lower has a book called Hitler's Furies that was published in 2013, and she looks specifically at the women, German women who went to occupy the East. So who went to occupy Poland and Ukraine and other parts of the Soviet Union. And I recall her estimate is over 100,000 women left Germany to participate in the occupation of the East. And so some would define all of those women as having been involved in Nazi-related crimes, right? But it depends what your definition is. So, for instance, in France, we know that by 1942, approximately 23,000 French women had left France to take jobs in Nazi Germany, right? So if we consider those 23,000 women Nazi collaborators when they returned back to France, right, that kind of affects our overall total. And so the difficulty is, do we think we're comparing the same thing? Right? Do we think a German woman who left to occupy, Sudetenland or Poland or wherever else is the same as a French woman who took a job in Berlin during the Nazi era? It's very hard to make these determinations. Where we get hard numbers, they're kind of fragmentary. So for instance, we know that in France, scholars have identified at least 454 women were killed in extrajudicial murders at the end of the war, right? Is that the total number of women? Absolutely not. What percentage of the overall number of women who were murdered after the war? I can't even begin to answer that, right? But to the point about prosecutions after German reunification, it's a kind of whole section of the book, and it's kind of interesting because we do see this pretty significant gap from the 1980s until the late 1990s. And essentially, one could make an argument that the publication in German of The Reader, which became the Hollywood movie, right, actually renewed interest in this question, because the focus of the book is your average female concentration camp guard who was prosecuted in a group trial, and was found guilty, and it kind of renewed attention to these women. And so we do see that there's this renewed push in the late 1990s towards further prosecution of women in Germany. In large part, they're kind of being discovered. So in 2007, there is a at-large Nazi war criminal who is just discovered in Vienna living comfortably in an apartment as an elderly woman, right? And so those dynamics keep changing. But generally, it is argued that there's just a complete loss of appetite for further prosecutions after the mid-1970s in both sides of Germany. And when reunification happens, the main development we see are actually individuals who are petitioning to have their the guilty verdicts against women in East Germany revoked. So we see some petitions that are filed that are essentially saying, my mom was not a Nazi war criminal. She was persecuted by the East German communist regime. Please take her conviction away. And by and large, those are all found to be unsubstantiated claims, and the convictions are upheld.
Thank you. Mark, did you have a question? No, I thought no? Okay.
I don't, sorry.
Sorry, no, I thought I saw your
Yep.
hand. Okay.
Yep.
Thank
you all for your excellent questions and your time, and I'm really glad to have this opportunity to share this research with you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Jessica, very much for your time. Sorry for the mix-up with the time. I mean, apparently Virginia already switched to daylight, saving time, and so the clock was changed, but we solved it.
That was great.
So thank you, everyone, for joining us. Have a rest of a good evening and quiet evening. We just had a siren before our meeting, and we hope that we won't have any more. Hope to see you in better times. Okay. So
Thank you.
take care. Jessica, if you could stay a minute. So, okay. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you for the invitation and for the very nice lecture and presentation. Bye.
Thank you.